Dr. Mary Ellen Doherty received her PhD from the University of Rhode Island, her nurse midwife preparation from the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey, her master's degree in nursing from Rutgers University, and her baccalaureate degree from Mount St. Mary College in New York. She is currently an associate professor at Western Connecticut State University, teaching in the undergraduate and graduate programs. She also is an active nurse practitioner, nurse midwife, rather. Sorry. Dr. Doherty is, the recipient of several awards for teaching and for research. She has published the results of several studies on a variety of topics, including the experience of midwifery clients, widowhood during pregnancy, and birth plan decision-making. She is also an active member of several professional organizations. The second speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Scannell-Desch, whom I guess I've known for about 1 million years, I think, at least. Received her PhD from Georgia State University, her MSN from the University of Pennsylvania. She also received her BSN from Mount St. Mary College in New York. Beth had a long and distinguished career in the Air Force, from which she retired in 1997. Since then, she has been a faculty member and more recently the chair and professor of nursing at Mount St. Mary College, the college from which both she and Mary Ellen received their baccalaureate degrees. Dr. Scannell-Desch is also the recipient of several awards for teaching and research and a number of commendations from the Air Force. She too has a number of publications and presentations. The research that Drs. Doherty and Scannell-Desch will be presenting this afternoon combines their interests and their combined expertise. Women's issues stemming from Dr. Doherty's interest and nurse midwifery background, and Dr. Scannell-Desch's interest stemming from her military background and her dissertation research, which was related to the experience of women military nurses during the Vietnam War. The study that they will be presenting this afternoon, or sharing with us this afternoon, will be published in the upcoming issue of the Journal of Nursing Scholarship. Please welcome Drs. Doherty and Scannell-Desch.
Good afternoon. I bring you greetings from Mount St. Mary College, Newburgh, New York,
and Western Connecticut State University in Danbury, Connecticut.
And before we start, we have a test question for you all, okay? And we know you're going to have refreshments later on, but do we have any physical resemblance to each other? How many want to vote for twins? And how many want to vote for just sisters? Okay, well, the twins group have it.
And I have to add, we are identical twins, but with the years and years and years, you look different a little bit.
And especially when you live in 2 different states and get your hair done at different places.
And especially if you have a bunch of children.
Okay, today we're going to be talking about a serious topic, and we're going to sort of walk you through this study since we do have a little bit more time than the presenters that preceded us. Our topic is the lived experience of U.S. military nurses in the Iraq and Afghani wars, 2003 to 2009. And the purpose of doing this study is to explore the common components of these nurses' lived experience that served in Iraq and Afghanistan during the war years. One of our other purposes is, and one of the aims of our study was, to get this out there. Every night, we all turn on the news, be it CNN or one of the New York or Philadelphia networks. And we see about what's going on in Afghanistan, and we see about what's going on in Iraq. And very rarely do they talk about any of the medics. And even more rarely than that do they talk about the nurses and the role that nurses are playing, U.S. nurses are playing in this war, or any other nurses. So we really felt that the bottom line was that we really wanted somebody to do this study and to get the word out. That nurses are full players at the table in supporting U.S. national interests. The Institutional Review Board approval took place at these 3 different institutions of higher learning. Mount St. Mary and Western Connecticut State in Danbury, because that's where we're both currently teaching. University of Massachusetts Lowell, because Dr. Doherty formerly taught there when we first were starting to do the necessary preliminary work on the study. Usually in qualitative research, and you can probably tell by the name, the lived experience, that we're heavily embedded in phenomenology in doing this study, very rarely do people spend much time on a literature review. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on a literature review either, but I did think that it's important to just briefly mention and give you some of the salient points about the only other 4 studies that have been done that investigated any aspect of nurses' experience in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And these are the 4 citations. Let me take you and tell you a little bit about the first study. Ross's et al. Study was a mixed qualitative method study that looked at post-deployment concerns of 72 Army, Navy, and Air Force nurses who deployed in the last 4 years, the 4 years prior to the study. These authors collected data using focus groups, telephone surveys, and email surveys. They coded their data using NVivo software, which is a qualitative software package that you can use. And it also not only coded the data, but it performed a content analysis on the data. 6 themes emerged from this study. They were logistics, supply, personnel, communication, reporting processes, and psychosocial issues. And let me just tell you a little bit about each of those. To summarize, logistical concerns focused on equipment shortages, housing and bathing inadequacies. And the nurses in that study, from what I remember, were pretty articulate about talking about the lack of bathing facilities. Their supply concerns focused on expired drugs, outdated medical supplies, and a lack of pediatric supplies. Their personnel concerns articulated a lack of critical care training for some of the nurses and medics, and a lack of training on some of the equipment that they were going to deploy with. Their communication concerns addressed difficulty at remote medical sites encountered in providing timely communication to their higher headquarters, and problems with terminology and training differences among the different branches of military services. We're a lot alike, but there are differences. They also found that they had communication equipment failures frequently. Their reporting process concerns focused on the lack of opportunity to contribute to ongoing action reports, to review previous reports that were written by people that staffed those deployed facilities before they arrived, and a lack of any feedback from the headquarters after they filed their reports. Their psychosocial concerns centered on nurses not knowing when they would return home, when the deployment would end, and also on certain leadership decisions that they perceived as hurting morale, and rumors and misinformation that added to their stress. Their study findings basically outlined food shortages, living in crowded tents, and the ability to shower only about once a week. They also found that they had uncertainty about whether they were going to be in a safe environment or not, the duration and frequency of their deployments, and the ability to contact their loved ones. They indicated that nurses valued and sought advice from previous from nurses that had previously returned from war, and they voiced concern about the challenge to continuously provide care to high volume of high acuity patients in a war zone environment. The second study that I just want to briefly mention is a descriptive study that looked at the knowledge and skills required to provide care to critically ill patients in aeromedical evacuation aircraft, in other words, the flying hospital aircraft that the United States Air Force uses. The sample included 23 Air Force critical care air transport team nurses. They again used multiple methods to collect their data: focus groups, participant observation, and patient chart review, as well as interviews with their respondents. The interview and focus group transcripts were analyzed also using in vivo software. The thematic analysis of this study identified clinical competence, operational competence, leadership, group cohesion, soldier and survival skills, and physical and emotional fitness as the most important skill set needed to be an Air Force critical care air transport team nurse in the Iraqi and Afghan theaters of operation. Oops. The third study was to describe injury characteristics of patients transported on Air-Evac aircraft in both theaters of operation, as well as patients that were being medevaced back to the United States. This was basically a chart review, a retrospective chart review of 3,492 patients. The findings indicated that 69% of the charts that they reviewed showed that the patients had polytrauma injuries, mostly orthopedic, including fractures and amputations, also vascular, chest, and abdominal injuries. This was the first research done for this current wartime scenario that looked at quantifying and categorizing the numbers and types of injuries being cared for on Air Force Air-Evac aircraft in the Iraq and Afghanistan theaters, as well as those patients that need to be transported back to the United States for definitive care. And the last study in our literature review was conducted by Kenny and Hall, and they wanted to investigate stressors of nurses working in 2 ICUs at military hospitals before and after the beginning of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They chose one hospital in Europe that was a stabilization center prior to returning patients to the United States. It was located in Germany, and the other hospital was located in the United States. Although they only got an 18% return rate of nurses working in these 2 ICUs, and this included civilian nurses working in the ICUs, active duty military, and reserve and National Guard nurses. Although the response rate was so low, 18% for both of these hospitals, they still decided to go ahead and review the anecdotal data because they felt that maybe the data would provide them a glimpse of what these nurses were going through. Questionnaires were distributed to the groups of nurses that I just mentioned, and content analysis revealed that before the war started, the nurses reported most ICU patients above the age of 50, carrying a cardiovascular, pulmonary, or complex surgical diagnoses. After the wars commenced, the respondents at both hospitals reported being stressed and overwhelmed by the number, the youth, and the criticality of arriving casualties. Both groups of nurses reported symptoms of compassion fatigue, such as irritability, anger, depression, sleeping difficulties, and a finding that they distanced themselves from others. Since no other studies other than these 4 have been done to date, and none have examined the lived experience of U.S. military nurses who served in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, our current study is a beginning step to explore this phenomenon in a research context.
Methodological assumptions. The volunteers agreed to be interviewed, and they were able to recall their experience as a military nurse in Iraq or Afghanistan. The volunteers will be willing to share their experiences as co-participants with us in this research. Common human experiences have some like elements for individuals. Phenomenology. Phenomenology is the study of human experience from the perspective of those experiencing a particular phenomenon. In particular, we followed the seminal works of Edmund Husserl, who is often referred to as the father of phenomenology. With this qualitative research method, the phenomenon of interest is whatever the respondents say it is. They own it because it's their experience.
The population for our study consisted of men and women registered nurses who served in the Army, Navy, or Air Force in Iraq or Afghanistan during the war years 2003 to 2009. As I said earlier, this included reservist and Air National Guard and Army National Guard nurses as well. The Department of Defense, although they cooperated with our study, and we have some people that we're going to acknowledge from the Department of Defense at the end, they were not able to provide us with a comprehensive contact list of people that met the study criteria. So what they suggested, and what we knew to do anyway, was start snowball sampling. I knew one person, an Army nurse, who had recently returned from Iraq, and I recontacted her. Dr. Doherty had 2 or 3 former students that had served in Iraq or Afghanistan while she was teaching at University of Massachusetts Lowell. So we started the snowballing with those 2 groups of people. In the end, we ended up with 37 nurses. The study setting included face-to-face interviews for 28 of the nurses. The remainder, we did telephonic taped interviews because although we had a grant, we didn't have enough money to buy multiple plane tickets, as most of you researchers can identify with.
Hawaii.
And there was no way that they were going to let us go to Tripler Army Hospital in Honolulu, Hawaii, to do interviews, even though we said we would be perfectly willing to go. Okay. We had 4 data-generating questions that guided this study. How would you describe the circumstances surrounding your assignment to Iraq or Afghanistan? What image or feeling or thought comes to mind when you hear the word Iraq or Afghanistan? What were the positives and negatives of this experience for you? And lastly, we had a catch-all question because we wanted to make sure we didn't miss anything. What else would you like to share with me about your experience, just in case we didn't touch on something that the respondent felt was very, very important and that they wanted to communicate?
Data analysis. All interviews were tape recorded and transcribed verbatim by the researchers. To save money and to really get a sense of the flavor of our data, we did them all ourselves. We used Kalasi's method, which is a seminal methodology used widely by qualitative researchers. And these are the steps of Kalasi's procedure. You obviously read all interviews to acquire a feeling for them. You review each interview and extract significant statements. You formulate meanings for each statement, organize the meanings into theme clusters, integrate the results into an exhaustive description of the phenomenon under study, and then you ask the participants about the findings as a final validating step. This is also called member checking.
I could go into all of the steps about credibility, confirmability, dependability, and transferability. but for the sake of time, if anyone wants to ask me a question about that, I can, tell you exactly what steps that we followed. But, we have to, in qualitative research, be able to assure rigor of our study and scientific merit of our study. And credibility, confirmability, dependability, and transferability are mechanisms that help you attain that, okay? So that you can defend it to your peers, and any publisher. Okay. We ended up with 37 military nurses, 18 from the Army, 15 from the Air Force, and 4 from the Navy. Now, when you look at this slide, you're going to say from first grade or second grade math, well, that adds up to 42. Well, it adds up to 42 because some of the nurses served 2 tours in either Iraq or Afghanistan, or maybe 1 in each. And it counted as a separate tour of duty. It was not uncommon, we found, for the Air Force nurses to serve 1 4- or 5-month tour on the ground, working in a fixed facility, a tent or trailer type facility, and then a year or 2 later to come back and serve a tour as a flight nurse. So these are our numbers. Our major findings included 7 themes and 7 sub-themes that are subsumed by the major themes. And I'll just read through these because we're going to spend more time on this. It's the findings you want to hear about, right? Deploying to war, an uncertain future. Remembrance of war, most chaotic scene. Nurses in harm's way, more than I bargained for. Kinship and bonding, my military family. My wartime stress, I'm a different person now. Professional growth, expanding my skills. Listen to me, advice to deploying nurses. The first theme is deploying to war. You're now going to hear the voices of the women and men and some of what they had to say.
Deploying to war, an Air Force nurse stated, I'm going to deploy for the 5th time next month. My last 3 deployments were as a flight nurse. I was deployed to Balad Air Base in Iraq to fly air evac missions inside Iraq and occasionally from Iraq to Germany. My last deployment was to Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan to fly air evac missions inside Afghanistan and sometimes from Afghanistan to Germany. Another Air Force nurse recalled, it was my daughter's 17th birthday when I got the call that in 2 weeks I'd be deploying to Iraq. They told me I was going to go for more weapons training and then off to Iraq. An Army reservist said, I was unofficially notified in November of 2006 that I would be deployed and that I was the 4th candidate contacted. The 3 people contacted before me had never deployed before, and all of them had a variety of reasons why they couldn't go. Then I was officially notified only 15 days prior to leaving that I was to report for duty. I was happy to serve my country, but I was disappointed in my peers. Another Army reservist said, I joined the Army Reserves after 9/11. I'm a lifelong Democrat. I was single, in good health, with no dependents, and I thought it was time for me to do something for my country. I called all 3 branches of the service, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. And I decided whichever one called me back first, that would be my choice. So the Army called first, and that's how I ended up in the Army. So I deployed to Iraq for 15 months. An Army nurse with a PhD, and she was stationed, I remember this, she was stationed in Hawaii, and I really wanted to go there to meet her. She said, although the timing was not the best for my family, I thought I need to go. Everyone in the service needs to go at least once. Another Army Reserve nurse stated, When the Twin Towers fell, I had 2 babies, and I said to my husband, I think I better get out of the reserves. He said, oh, I don't think you need to do it right away. You don't need to do it that fast. So I didn't think about it for a while. I only had 3 years left till retirement. Then I got the call, so I deployed to Iraq for 15 months.
Sub-theme, living conditions, a mixed bag.
A nurse in Iraq commented, the living conditions were not ideal. We lived in what the military calls a CHU, C-H-U, which means a containerized housing unit. You've seen containers on ships? Well, you take a container and you put 2 windows in it and a door, and that's what we lived in. You usually have 2 people living in each container. This one's a little funny. A male nurse practitioner added, on July 26, 2007, it was 142 degrees in Iraq. I sent my wife a picture of the digital thermometer that we set up in the back of the hospital, and it read 142 degrees. My wife called me after she got the picture and said, but dear, it's dry heat. I said, okay, this is what I want you to do. Turn on the oven to 142 degrees, wait a half an hour, and then stick your head in it. We have to keep our sense of humor. Another nurse mentioned, everything was coated with a layer of fine dust. No matter what, everything always felt dirty, but you get used to it. A nurse anesthetist stated, when the war started, we took on heavy casualties. I went without a shower for 11 days. The OR was like a litter box. We just scooped out the bloody sand and other body secretions. An Army nurse recalled, I ended up in a tent with 79 of my best friends. I didn't know how bad it was until I got reassigned to Baghdad, where I had my own trailer. An Air Force nurse remarked, I was lucky to be in Bagram in 2008. We had a coffee shop and a Dairy Queen. We lived in 2-person trailers. We had TV, internet, a library, a theater, and a gym.
My workplace, a plane, a tent, or a trailer.
A nurse talked about her tent hospital. I worked in the ICU in a tent hospital in Balad, Iraq. They tried to send me to the ER to work a few times, but I was always able to wiggle out of it. I didn't want to go to the ER because they had all the raw trauma. In the ICU, at least they were all bandaged up. Another nurse talked about her trailer hospital. The hospital Al-Hasid in Anbar province was a whole lot of trailers hooked together. The only thing we didn't have was MRI capability. Otherwise, we were like a stateside level 1 trauma center. We could handle just about everything. An Air Force flight nurse recalled, sometimes we'd fly out on an alert mission where there would be life-threatening injuries from an explosion or gunshot wounds, and we'd bypass Balad and go straight to Germany with the casualties. I flew on a C-17 and C-130 aircraft. The C-17 is like the Cadillac of war aeromedical evacuation. It's large, environmentally controlled, and can fly long distances. Another nurse stated, we had helicopters coming in every night with casualties. We would land on the helipad and they would land on the helipad and we would move them to the ER and we would triage them. Then the walking wounded would come straight to our tent and we'd evaluate them and send them over to the main hospital.
Diversions from war, a piece of home.
An Air Force nurse in Bagram, Afghanistan stated, I tried to get out of the hospital to do other things during my off-duty time. The chapel office offered activities which were a very important outlet for me. They had church services, discussion groups, country line dancing, game night, and other social and recreational activities. It was such an important outlet from work. Another nurse added, we'd play computer games, watch movies, play cards, and work out in the gym. An Army nurse recalled, I was there for 6 months, and the biggest positive for me was support from home. My husband, my children, my relatives, and my friends were so supportive. And total strangers were supportive. I cannot underestimate the effect and impact of total strangers. I received 93 packages and 350 cards while I was there, and a large part was from total strangers. Another nurse added, I grew spiritually while I was there. I think because it was a hard time, I clung to God more than I did back in the United States. An Army nurse said, physical fitness took on a new value for me. I do very well in my physical fitness training, and I see where it's used as a motivator. For example, if I'm feeling down or depressed, I know it's probably time to go running.
Second theme, remembrance of war, most chaotic scene.
An Army nurse summarized her ER experience. War injuries are truly the most horrific injuries a trauma nurse will ever see. People with their legs blown off from IEDs, improvised explosive devices. Bloody flesh that looks like chunks of meat hanging off missing legs or feet. Blood splattering everywhere, people screaming and crying. It is the most chaotic scene one could ever imagine. Another ER nurse added, we had 3 young soldiers brought into our ER. An RPG, rocket-propelled grenade, had ripped through their Humvee, a little below seating height, and it traumatically amputated all 6 of their legs. One soldier was unconscious and on a ventilator, another was doing okay, and the third soldier was like, and this is what she said, a squirrel set out in the middle of the road and didn't know which way to go. He was panic-stricken. He sat up on the gurney, looked down, and just screamed bloody murder. Oh my God, I don't have any legs. He threw himself back on the gurney and just continued to scream at the top of his lungs. I had to go, the nurse said, I had to go outside and throw up. It just made me physically sick to see this poor child the way he was. I think it was the first instance that he realized that he didn't actually have legs anymore. It took hours to get this child calmed down so we could put him on a medevac plane to Germany.
Subtheme, my soldier patients.
Nurses described special soldier patients that they would never forget. A Navy nurse remembered, my patient was a Marine sergeant. He was my first Iraq casualty. We got a radio call that they were bringing in a tourniquet injury, which means that all his limbs were blown off. He was a typical Marine. Marines take it. His corpsman had tourniqueted all his extremities, and he was a dusky gray color. He had lost a lot of blood, but he was still conscious and talking. He leaned close to me and said, ma'am, please tell my mother and my sister I'm sorry. Then the doc said, okay, we're taking the tourniquets down now. And within 7 seconds, he was gone. An Army Reserve nurse stated, and I remember this particular one because she had graduated from the university where I used to teach. I didn't have her as a student, she had already graduated. There is one time I will always remember, she said. There was a Marine that I became friends with. We were just friends. If we'd see each other at lunch, we'd sit together. Sometimes we'd go to the gym together. He was a second lieutenant like me. We would often chit-chat over coffee. Then one day he told me that he wouldn't be around for a while because he was going out on a mission. 3 days later, I get a call that it's my turn to go out on an angel flight to pick up bodies. Well, It was him. And the only way I found out was because of his dog tag attached to a boot. Evidently, there were 3 Marines together, and one of them stepped on an IED. There were no bodies, just pieces. There was nothing for me to recognize except his dog tag. Another trauma nurse reported, right before I came home, I took care of a young gal from California. We got a horrible call from the Marines, and we couldn't really make out what they were saying because everybody was so upset, and they were all yelling and screaming. Anytime Marines get hurt, they are upset. But this was different. We couldn't hear anything they were saying because there was so much screaming. The Humvees came around the corner, and we could see that the patient's head was all wrapped up and bleeding profusely. Finally, we got the patient on the table, and we cut through the uniform, and we see breasts. It's a woman Marine. She was the only woman in the unit and had just gotten promoted to sergeant. A sniper got her and blew off half of her head. There was not much we could do. The nurse said, I have 5 kids, and she looked like my daughter. She was a very pretty girl, what was left of her. The back of her head was completely gone.
Sub-theme, children caught in the chaos.
Nurses reported great empathy toward the children that they took care of, and they do take care of a lot of pediatric patients in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And the nurses also felt outrage at the injuries that were inflicted on the children. A nurse remembered, we got in 7 children at the same time. They were playing soccer, and someone threw a mortar onto the soccer field. An Air Force nurse reported, many of the nationals put kerosene in the drinking water bottles, and kids would accidentally drink them, thinking they were water. So you have a brain-dead baby in the ICU, and you try to explain to the parents that it's not a good idea to put kerosene in drinking water bottles. They can't understand why you can't save their baby because you're an American and you can fix anything. An Army Reserve nurse recalled, one day I had to fly in and pick up 3 little kids, twin girls and their brother. I did my best, but we lost all of them. There was only so much you can do on a helicopter. I was trying to stop the bleeding, and it was horrible. I got in trouble when we landed back at the hospital because I had put the twins on the same stretcher because they were small. I caught flack because of that. It was not SOP, standard operating procedure. I felt they needed to be together. They were twins. They came into the world together, and I felt they should go out of the world together. An Air Force nurse remarked, in Afghanistan, I cared for a lot of kids. It gets very hot at night, and the families go up on the roof to cool off. The kids aren't well supervised, so they fall off, giving way to head injuries and fractures. Another nurse added, I took care of many burned children. The Afghans use a type of kerosene kettle to heat up their rice. The kids would catch themselves on fire by accident. Some of them ended up with 70% burns. I'll remember them for the rest of my life.
10 minutes. Caring for the enemy.
Many nurses were assigned to detainee care at the prison hospitals, and they reported having difficulty in dealing with this assignment. An Army Reserve nurse stated, I found what we had to do was horrendous. We were taking care of the enemy. You have a U.S. soldier in one bed and an Iraqi insurgent in the next bed. They were in the same firefight. The soldier was almost killed by the insurgent. This was really a tough situation for me. Another nurse added, no one wanted to do the detainee mission. We were afraid of them, and I think if we had a choice ahead of time, we would have all have left. An Army nurse recalled she was assigned to the Abu Ghraib prison. When I went to Abu Ghraib, we had a very busy ICU. We took care of acute blast injuries, gunshot wounds, traumatic amputations, and burns. Since we were doing detainee care, we also had detainees with heart attacks, renal failure, and the like.
The third theme is Nurses in Harm's Way, more than I bargained for.
An Army nurse recalled, "We were mortared in Mosul from the first week I was there. We actually had 17 mortar hits in one night. One female took shrapnel in the abdomen, another in the shoulder. After that, I was very happy to leave Mosul." Another nurse added, "I kept thinking, I can't believe someone is shooting at me with intent to harm. You wouldn't think that would be the case in a hospital zone." A nurse anesthetist related, "I was scared. I always had my 9mm handgun in my shoulder holster, even in the OR. I never took it off. I always had a clip of bullets loaded in it too. I never left it. It was always with me." An Army lieutenant stated, "Sometimes I'd have to go out in a helicopter, and sometimes when I had to get out, there'd be bullets flying over me. The soldiers provided cover so I could treat their wounded buddy in the field. One time I went out to get a wounded soldier, and they thought the area was secure, and then all of a sudden, a vehicle comes over the hill, and boom, I go flying up in the air, and I land on top of my patient. He says, 'Are you okay?' He had a leg wound, so he was able to talk to me. I said, 'Yeah, I'm ready to go, are you?' And he said, 'Yeah,' and his buddies helped me drag him to the chopper." The nurses described the dangers they faced, and 2 of the nurses that we interviewed this past summer were wounded in enemy attacks. One nurse recalled, "I was hit by a mortar blast. I was hit with shrapnel in the neck, and I have right-sided hearing loss. I had just left the trauma unit and was walking through the galley when my compound was hit." Another nurse was shot in the arm, and this happened a year ago, March. It's not that long ago. 4 of us were jogging on an Afghan army base. An insurgent dressed in an Afghan army uniform opened fire on us with an AK-47 automatic rifle from a security tower. First, I was shot in the arm. Then my best friend and another jogger were killed. Our other running buddy was not hit, and he took off to get help. Everything happened so fast. I was only shot once, and I think I saved my own life by staying down and pretending to be dead. I was lifeless. My best friend was hit in the thigh, and she was moaning and rolling around, and then he shot her again in the back, and that finished her off. The other jogger was shot in the head and probably died instantly because his brains were all over the grass.
Kinship and bonding, my military family, which is the 4th theme.
Nurses commented on friendship, bonding, camaraderie, and teamwork. One nurse said, "We saved a lot of lives, nobody complained, and everybody did what they had to." Another said, "We helped each other, we talked about our experiences, we shared our thoughts and feelings, and it helped because you knew you were not there alone." A nurse in Baghdad reflected, "The bonding of military people will always stand out in my mind. When we were getting hit with many mass casualties, everyone pulled together and worked so hard to save lives. Our teamwork was phenomenal." A male nurse recalled, "I remember telling my wife that performing this job was probably the most rewarding of my career. If I could have this same job back in the States with my family there, I'd never leave because of the camaraderie, the sense of teamwork. It was absolutely the best. I've never seen docs and nurses work so well together. You're all in the same situation, and you're working together to get through the year."
My wartime stress, I'm a different person now.
An Army Reserve nurse stated, and this is one of my ex-students, "Since I've been home, I suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, horribly. I feel guilty because I was not one out there getting shot at. I'm amazed at how many of us still can't get back into our lives because we are so affected by this experience. 16 months was too long to be there, too long to be away from home and everything you know and love." A male Army reservist added, "I recently started going to the VA hospital because I'm having anxiety and panic issues at work. I found my reserve for empathy and compassion was drained. Anything could set me off, make me mad, and make me verbal. Before I went to Iraq, I was a laid-back person. I didn't let a lot bother me. Now I'm increasingly bothered, and it seems to only happen to me at work. Another nurse reported, when I came home, I didn't know why I was depressed, when I should be happy. I could not sleep. I was only sleeping about 3 hours a night, and you can imagine over time how that affects you. You are trying to act happy because everyone is throwing you a party or taking you out to dinner. I cried every day right from the start as soon as I got home. I didn't know why these things were happening, and I didn't know that I had PTSD. Another added, I had been medicating myself with Benadryl for sleep while I was in Iraq. It helped at times, but I had to keep increasing the dose. I started with 25 milligrams and worked up to 150. It took me months after I came home to realize that I needed help, and I finally went to the VA system.
Homecoming, a difficult adjustment.
Most nurses found homecoming more difficult than they expected. A nurse remarked, "You expect to be so happy when you come home and you think, why am I having difficulty sleeping? Why am I so irritable? I should be feeling good." You get home and it's not the way that you thought it was going to be, and you're dealing with a lot of pent-up emotions that you couldn't show in the war zone. Another said, coming home was tougher than I anticipated. I thought everything would be normal. Well, nothing is normal. An OR nurse recounted, since I came home, I don't have much tolerance for little things that people complain about. When I came home, I really had to learn patience again. Another added, when I came home, I was so exhausted. I just wanted to lie on the couch and do nothing. It was difficult to get my motivation back. Getting back into old routines has been a major struggle.
Professional growth, expanding my skills.
Many nurses describe their clinical skills as expanded in terms of breadth and depth. An ICU nurse reported, the skills I learned with all the traumas was very beneficial. I got to do things as a nurse that I'll probably never get to do again. An Army nurse practitioner recalled, the Army was building a new hospital in Anbar province, and this was during the surge, so they needed me there. Although I was a nurse practitioner, they needed me in surgery as a first assistant. I said, I don't do ORs. And they said, don't worry, we're going to teach you. So they taught me. With all the amputations coming in, I was very busy.
And the last theme is listen to me, advice to deploying nurses.
Nurses gave advice. I've talked to nurses and I encourage them to volunteer for Iraq. One of them says, I tell them, honey, if you want the experience of a lifetime that you will never forget, go to Iraq. Another added, I think every military nurse needs to go. They need to see what war is about, to see the injuries, and to see what our young troops are going through. A Navy nurse advised, I would tell them to make sure that they have some outlets before they go, that they can go back to when they're over there and they need a break. An Air Force major added, working at a big hospital versus a mobile one is going to be different. Big bases are more developed. Those who deployed in the earlier years experienced more primitive conditions than those who went in 2006 or later. Living conditions and meal options have become better as time has progressed.
Our study conclusions are listed here on the slide. Basically, we have to be concerned with the memories because they're etched on the nurses' minds forever. Nurses in our study were surprised at the number of injured children that they ended up taking care of. And as I said earlier, in some other studies, it's been shown that they had a problem with a lack of pediatric supplies. Some nurses were disappointed that their mission was detainee care. and they were fearful of that, and also they wanted to be taking care of the American GI. Nurses reported being ill-prepared for the psychological effects of providing care in a war zone. Homecoming, as Dr. Doherty said, was much more difficult than anticipated by the majority of the nurses in our study. The majority of the nurses described the experience as a challenge and personally and professionally rewarding. Many of them volunteered the statement that if I was called to go again, I would go in a heartbeat. Deployed nurses see an important role for themselves in preparing other future generations of military nurses for wartime deployment. We also found that the bonding and camaraderie among military personnel was described as pivotal in making the deployment environment tolerable, because these people became their family. Our general conclusions are that this study is just an initial look at the lived experience of deployed nurses in these two theaters. It extends the developing body of knowledge about nursing in wartime and also breaks new ground in examining the experiences of nurses in the two current wars. Phenomenology provided a very fruitful methodology for this study. Our recommendations: future studies on various aspects of deployment need to be conducted, specifically focusing on PTSD symptoms in nurses, a comparison of nurses who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, the two different theaters, a comparison of male and female nurses, a comparison of nurses who were parents as opposed to those who were not parents at the time of deployment. Many of the people talked about issues with the children and missing their children, etc. And also a comparison study of nurses who deployed to the same country in the early years as opposed to the late years, especially having to do with the living conditions. Our implications for nursing are that it's been estimated that approximately 70% of returning veterans, not just nurse veterans, but veterans in general, have some degree of PTSD. And as studies go on, we may find that's even higher. It appears that nurses serving the longer tours of duty in the war zone, those that were there for 12, 13, 14, 15 months, some 16 months, were at greater risk for PTSD than those that served a 3-month or 4-month tour. Nurses in harm's way are not readily identified in the global news. More needs to be written about and studied about the role of nurses in war. Lastly, we have some acknowledgments. From the Army, we wanted to acknowledge Colonel Jennifer Wilbur, who's retired. She was also a professor with me at University of Massachusetts Lowell and was a great help and gave us a lot of advice. Also, Colonel retired Linda Kistner of the U.S. Air Force. Surgeon General's Office. Surgeon General's Office, and Captain Karen Lunds of the Navy. We also want to thank our funding source. I want to make sure I get this right. We received a grant from Connecticut State University System, AAUP, last May that helped us extend this study to be able to go to the Washington, D.C. area and the South and to interview more nurses last summer. Lastly, we would like to thank the 37 nurses who participated in this study. They were courageous, open, and honest nurses. At times, they were humorous and self-deprecating. They poured out their hearts to us, and they welcomed us into their homes and neighborhoods. They believed in our study, and they wanted their voices to be heard. Thank you very much. Thank you.